The afternoon should have been ordinary. Steven Seagal stepped out into the open space just outside the venue, sunglasses on, moving calmly through the crowd. It wasn't a movie premiere or a spotlight moment, just a routine public appearance. Fans lingered nearby, a few phones discreetly raised, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then everything changed. A police officer across the street locked eyes on him. At first, no one paid attention. Officers watched crowds all the time. But this one didn't look away. His gaze followed Steven's every step, narrowing with suspicion. Within seconds, he began walking straight toward him, slow, deliberate, and already irritated. "Sir, stop right there." The sudden command cut through the noise. Conversations paused. A few heads turned. Steven stopped calmly and turned around. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, respectful. Instead of answering, the cop looked him up and down, lingering too long, judging. "I need to see some ID," the officer said sharply. Steven blinked, surprised but compliant. "Sure. May I ask why?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I'm asking the questions." The tone wasn't professional. It was hostile. People nearby began to sense it too. This wasn't routine. This wasn't normal. Steven slowly reached for his wallet, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "I just want to understand what this is about." The officer stepped closer, too close. "You match a description," he snapped. "What description?" Steven asked. The cop didn't answer. A woman nearby whispered, "Isn't that Steven Seagal?" Someone else quietly pulled out their phone. Another followed. Within seconds, multiple cameras were recording. Steven noticed, but didn't react. "Sir, turn around," the officer ordered. Steven hesitated, confused. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong." That's when the cop's expression hardened completely. "I said turn around. Now." The air felt heavy. The crowd had grown silent. People sensed something ugly unfolding in real time. Steven slowly raised his hands, not in fear, but in disbelief. No one there could have imagined that this moment, this single interaction, was the beginning of a chain reaction that would completely destroy one man's career in just 9 minutes. And the officer standing there had no idea what he'd just started. The officer didn't wait for an explanation. As Steven Seagal stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, the cop took a step closer, invading his personal space, asserting control without saying a word. The silence itself felt aggressive. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer said. "They are," Steven replied calmly, lifting them slightly. His voice was steady, controlled. He wasn't trying to escalate anything. But the officer had already decided this wasn't going to be a normal interaction. "You're being very uncooperative," the cop said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Steven frowned slightly. "I've complied with everything you've asked. I just want to know why I'm being stopped." The officer ignored the question. Instead, he reached for his radio, pressing the button slowly, dramatically. "I've got a suspicious individual refusing to cooperate," he said. That was when murmurs spread through the crowd. "Suspicious," someone whispered. "He hasn't done anything," another voice said quietly. Steven heard it all, but he didn't react. He had dealt with pressure before, real pressure. This wasn't fear. This was disbelief. "Officer," Steven said evenly, "I'm not resisting. I haven't broken any laws." The cop's eyes hardened. "You don't get to decide that." A phone camera zoomed in. Another person stepped closer to get a better angle. The crowd had grown, not large, but dense. Enough people to witness what was happening. Enough to make the officer's posture stiffen with pride rather than caution. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer ordered. Stephen hesitated, not out of defiance, but confusion. "Am I being detained?" The officer leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "You're about to be." That was the moment things crossed a line. Stephen took a breath. "I'd like to know the reason before I comply." The officer scoffed. "You don't look like someone who listens." That sentence hit differently. The crowd reacted immediately. Faces changed. Eyes widened. People exchanged looks. It wasn't just rude, it was personal. Stephen slowly turned his head, meeting the officer's eyes. "There's no reason to speak to me like that." The officer smirked. "I'll speak however I want." Now the tension was undeniable. A man in the crowd whispered, "This is getting out of hand." Another shook their head. Someone else muttered, "Why is he being treated like this?" Stephen exhaled slowly, choosing restraint. "I'm asking respectfully. What law am I violating?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Stephen's arm, not violently, but firmly enough to make a point. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Hey!" someone shouted. Stephen stiffened but didn't pull away. "Officer, don't do that." "Don't tell me how to do my job," the cop snapped. Phones were fully raised now. No one was hiding it anymore. This was clearly not a private stop. It was a public spectacle. Stephen glanced around briefly, noticing the cameras, the faces, the disbelief. Still, he stayed calm. "I am cooperating," he said slowly. "But this feels unnecessary." The officer rolled his eyes. "You people always say that." That was the moment everything changed. The words hung in the air, ugly, loaded, undeniable. The crowd reacted instantly. "What do you mean, you people?" a woman asked loudly. The officer ignored her completely. Stephen's jaw tightened. "Officer," he said firmly, "that comment was inappropriate." The cop laughed. "Now you're telling me what's appropriate." He turned to the crowd. Everyone stepped back. No one moved. Instead, more people stopped walking. More phones came out. The scene had become impossible to ignore. Stephen stood there, calm but clearly offended, not for himself alone, but for what this moment represented. "I've done nothing wrong," he said one last time. The officer stared at him, jaw clenched, eyes cold. "We'll see about that." And with that, he reached toward his cuffs. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "This is abuse of power." Another voice yelled, "He's not resisting." The officer didn't care. He had authority. Or at least, he thought he did. And as the metal cuffs dangled from his hand, the tension reached a breaking point, because everyone watching could feel it now. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about ego. And it was about to get much worse. What city and country are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments below and keep watching, because the next moment changes everything. For a split second, time seemed to slow. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the cold metal of the handcuffs. Steven Seagal noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. "Officer," Stephen said calmly, "this is unnecessary." The cop didn't respond. Instead, he stepped behind Stephen and grabbed his wrist. That single motion shattered whatever balance remained. "Hey! What are you doing?" someone shouted from the crowd. Stephen didn't resist. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his head slightly. "I'm cooperating," he said clearly, loud enough for the cameras to hear. "There is no reason for restraints." The officer yanked Stephen's arm behind his back anyway. A sharp metallic click echoed through the air. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The first cuff snapped shut around Stephen's wrist. Phones shot higher. People moved closer. This was no longer curiosity, it was outrage. "Are you serious right now?" a man yelled. "He's not fighting you," another voice added. Stephen closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. Years of discipline showed in that moment. His face remained controlled, but the humiliation was unmistakable. The officer forced Stephen's other arm back. "Stop," Stephen said firmly. "You're hurting me." That only seemed to fuel the officer. "You should have thought about that before being difficult," the cop replied. The second cuff clicked into place. Steven Seagal, handcuffed in public. The crowd fell silent for half a second. Then chaos. What crime did he commit? This is insane. Get his badge number. A woman near the front shook her head in disbelief. This is abuse. Pure abuse. Stephen stood there, wrists locked behind his back, shoulders squared. He didn't shout. He didn't insult the officer. He didn't plead. Instead, he lifted his chin and spoke slowly, clearly, directly into the cameras surrounding him. "I am not resisting," he said. "I have asked for a reason for my detention, and I have not been given one." The officer grabbed Stephen by the elbow and pulled him forward. "Move," he barked. Stephen stumbled slightly but regained his balance. The movement caused the cuffs to tighten. His jaw clenched, but still he said nothing. People stepped forward instinctively. "Don't touch him like that. You're being recorded. You're going to regret this." The officer turned toward the crowd, anger flashing across his face. "Back up." "No." No one moved. Instead, more people started speaking. "You're embarrassing yourself. This isn't how law enforcement works." "He hasn't done anything." The officer's radio crackled suddenly. "Unit 47, status check." The cop ignored it. Stephen noticed. He looked at the radio, then back at the officer. "You should answer that," he said calmly. The officer glared at him. "You don't tell me what to do." He tightened his grip and tried to pull Stephen again. That was when the crowd's tone shifted, from shock to fury. "This is unlawful. Someone call a supervisor. Get internal affairs on the phone." Stephen inhaled deeply. "Officer," he said quietly, "this doesn't need to go any further." The cop laughed bitterly. "Too late for that." Cameras zoomed in on Stephen's face. Sweat beaded lightly at his temple, not from fear, but from pressure. From restraint. From the weight of what was unfolding. He scanned the crowd briefly. Dozens of people. Dozens of witnesses. Then, without drama, without announcement, Stephen spoke one simple sentence, barely above a normal speaking volume. "Please make sure you keep recording." The effect was immediate. People nodded. Phones steadied. Angles adjusted. The officer noticed too late. "What did you say?" he snapped. Stephen met his eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about, unless you're doing something wrong." The officer's face flushed red. "You think you're smart," he said. "You think being on camera scares me?" Stephen didn't answer. Because he was no longer talking to the officer. He was talking to time. Every second that passed. Every camera rolling. Every witness watching. The crowd wasn't just observing anymore. They were documenting. And somewhere in the distance, sirens could be heard. Another unit was arriving. The officer finally glanced over his shoulder, irritation flickering into uncertainty. For the first time since this began, his confidence wavered. Stephen noticed that too. And for the first time since the cuffs went on, Stephen allowed himself a small, controlled breath. Because the situation had shifted. The officer still had the handcuffs. But Stephen had something far more powerful now. Witnesses. Evidence. Time. And the countdown had officially begun. If you were standing there and saw this happening, would you step in or keep recording? Comment, "Step in," or record below, and stay with us, because the next part changes everything. The sirens grew louder. Not close, yet, but unmistakable. The officer's grip tightened on Stephen's arm as he glanced down the street. For the first time since this began, his posture shifted. Just slightly. Enough for Stephen to notice. "Stand right here," the officer ordered, positioning Stephen beside a metal barrier. "Don't move." Stephen didn't respond. He didn't need to. The crowd had thickened now. What started as a handful of bystanders had grown into a tight semicircle of witnesses, faces serious, phones raised, voices low but angry. The energy had changed. This was no longer entertainment. It was accountability forming in real time. The officer finally pressed the button on his radio. "Unit 47, he said curtly. "I have one detained. Possible obstruction." A pause. Then a voice crackled back. "Copy that. What's the basis for detention?" The officer hesitated. Stephen watched him carefully. "Suspicious behavior," the cop replied. There it was again. Stephen tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious isn't a crime," he said calmly. "Quiet," the officer snapped. But the damage was done. Several people in the crowd exchanged looks. One man shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Another voice came through the radio. "Supervisor en route. Body cam is on, correct?" The officer stiffened. "Affirmative." Stephen's eyes flicked briefly to the camera on the officer's chest. Still blinking red. Still recording. "Good." The officer cleared his throat. "Everything's under control," he added quickly. Stephen almost smiled. Almost. Minutes passed, but they felt longer. Every second stretched, heavy with anticipation. Stephen stood still, shoulders relaxed despite the cuffs. His breathing was slow and measured. Anyone watching closely could tell, this wasn't a man panicking. This was a man waiting. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Why hasn't he told them what Stephen did?" Someone else answered quietly, "Because he didn't do anything." The officer heard it. His jaw tightened. "Everyone needs to back up," he shouted again. No one moved. Instead, a man near the front raised his voice. "Officer, what law did he break?" Silence. Another voice followed. "Why is he handcuffed?" Still nothing. The officer avoided eye contact with the crowd now. His attention stayed fixed forward, as if staring hard enough could keep control from slipping away. Stephen spoke again, his voice low but clear. "Officer, this is being recorded by multiple people. If there's a misunderstanding, now is the time to correct it." The officer laughed nervously. "You think you're in charge here?" "No," Stephen replied. "But the truth usually is." The radio crackled again. "Unit 47, supervisor arriving in approximately 3 minutes." 3 minutes. Stephen counted silently. The officer shifted his stance. He adjusted his belt. He checked his cuffs. Small movements, subtle signs of discomfort. The crowd noticed too. A young man whispered, "He looks nervous now." Another replied, "Good." Stephen's phone buzzed in his pocket. He couldn't reach it, but he knew exactly who was calling. He didn't need to answer. They already knew. He looked up at the officer. "You might want to loosen those cuffs," he said evenly. "They're too tight." The officer snapped back, "They're fine." Stephen nodded slowly. "I'll make sure that's noted." That sentence landed harder than any insult. The officer's eyes widened just a fraction. Noted by who? Stephen didn't answer. He didn't have to. A black SUV turned onto the street and slowed near the crowd. Then another patrol car pulled in behind it. Doors opened. 2 officers stepped out, older, calmer, scanning the scene carefully. The crowd parted instinctively. The supervisor approached, eyes moving from the handcuffs to the cameras to the officer's face. "What's going on here?" he asked. The officer straightened immediately. "Sir, this individual was acting suspiciously and refused to cooperate." Stephen spoke before the supervisor could respond. "I cooperated fully," he said calmly. "I asked for the reason for my detention and was never given one." The supervisor looked at Stephen closely. Then he looked at the cuffs. Then he looked at the crowd. "Is that accurate?" he asked the officer. The officer hesitated. Just for a second. That was all it took. Stephen met the supervisor's eyes. "You can review the body cam," he said. "It will show everything." The supervisor nodded slowly. "We will." The officer's confidence collapsed in real time. The crowd leaned in, silent, watching. This was it. The countdown was almost over. Because in moments like this, power doesn't disappear all at once. It drains, second by second. And with every camera still rolling, every witness still watching, the truth was no longer something the officer could control. It was already on its way. The supervisor stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. His eyes moved from Stephen's restrained hands to the officer standing stiffly beside him. Then he looked at the body camera, still blinking red. "Let's start from the beginning," the supervisor said calmly. "Why was this man stopped?" The officer swallowed. He matched a description. "What description?" the supervisor asked. The pause felt endless. I don't have it memorized," the officer replied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The supervisor's expression hardened. "You detained and handcuffed someone based on a description you can't explain?" The officer's face flushed. He was being difficult. Stephen spoke softly but clearly. "I asked for the reason for the stop. I complied with every instruction." The supervisor nodded once, then turned back to the officer. "Is that true?" The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I recommend we review the body cam footage," the supervisor said. The officer stiffened. "Sir, that won't be necessary." "It is," the supervisor cut in. He reached for the tablet clipped to his belt and synced it to the body cam feed. The screen flickered, then began playing. The crowd leaned forward. Stephen watched quietly as the footage replayed the beginning of the encounter, the moment the officer approached, the tone of his voice, the refusal to explain the stop. The words echoed clearly now, stripped of authority and exposed under scrutiny. "You don't look like someone who listens." A wave of discomfort passed through the onlookers. The supervisor's jaw tightened. The footage continued, Stephen asking calmly why he was being detained. The officer ignoring the question. The comment, "You people always say that." The supervisor paused the video. "What did you mean by that?" he asked the officer. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean anything by it." The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "Then explain it." Silence. Stephen felt the cuffs tighten slightly as the officer adjusted his stance. An unconscious reaction, a man realizing control was slipping through his fingers. The supervisor resumed the video. The handcuffs came out. The crowd's reaction was audible. Stephen's calm voice filled the air. "I am not resisting." The supervisor stopped the footage again. "Why were handcuffs applied?" he asked. "For officer safety," the cop replied quickly. The supervisor nodded slowly. "At what point did he threaten you?" The officer hesitated. "He didn't." "Did he attempt to flee?" "No." "Did he resist physically?" "No." The supervisor locked eyes with him. "Then explain the cuffs." The officer had no answer. The crowd was completely silent now. Stephen felt something loosen, physically and mentally. Not the cuffs yet, but the pressure. The truth had shifted the balance. The supervisor turned toward Stephen. "Sir, I apologize for what you've experienced so far." Stephen nodded once. "Thank you." Then the supervisor addressed the officer. "Remove the cuffs." The officer froze. "Sir." "Now." Slowly, reluctantly, the officer stepped behind Stephen and unlocked the cuffs. The metal fell away with a dull clink. Stephen rolled his wrists gently, breathing out for the first time in several minutes. The crowd reacted instantly. Some clapped, others exhaled in relief. The supervisor wasn't finished. "Step aside," he ordered the officer. The officer obeyed, eyes downcast. The supervisor turned to the crowd. "This interaction is now under official review. Anyone who recorded footage, please preserve it." People nodded. Phones stayed raised. Stephen adjusted his jacket, composed as ever. "May I speak?" he asked. The supervisor nodded. Stephen turned slightly toward the cameras. "What happened here isn't about me," he said calmly. "It's about accountability. Authority without restraint leads to injustice." The crowd listened intently. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The supervisor turned back to him. "You're relieved of duty pending investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon." The officer's eyes widened. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding." The supervisor shook his head. "No. This is documented." The officer slowly removed his badge. The sound of metal hitting the supervisor's palm echoed louder than it should have. That sound marked the moment everything changed. Stephen watched quietly. No smile. No satisfaction. Just resolution. Because the truth didn't need celebration. It needed consequences. And those consequences were just beginning. The air felt different now. Not tense. Heavy. The officer stood off to the side, no longer in control. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of reality had finally landed. His badge was gone. His authority stripped in front of witnesses, cameras, and colleagues. The supervisor spoke into his radio. "Internal Affairs has been notified. Full report will follow." Those words echoed louder than any siren. Stephen stood quietly nearby, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. The red marks were visible. Cameras zoomed in, not aggressively, but deliberately. Evidence. Proof. A second supervisor approached Stephen. "Sir, are you okay?" Stephen nodded. "I am. Thank you." The officer who had detained him avoided eye contact, staring instead at the pavement. The crowd watched him now, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. A man in the crowd spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is why people don't trust the system." No one disagreed. The supervisor turned to the crowd again. "We will be collecting statements from witnesses. Anyone willing to speak, please remain." Hands went up immediately. Stephen observed the scene carefully. He could have left. He had every right to walk away now. But he stayed. Because moments like this weren't just personal. They were public. The supervisor approached Stephen once more. "Sir, you're free to go. We're very sorry for the inconvenience." Stephen nodded politely. "I'll stay. People deserve to be heard." That simple statement shifted the mood again. Phones captured it. Voices murmured approval. The officer stiffened at the word inconvenience, as if it burned. This hadn't been an inconvenience. It had been a violation. 2 Internal Affairs representatives arrived within minutes, dressed plainly, notebooks already open. They didn't waste time. "Officer," one of them said, "we need your statement." The officer hesitated. "Do I need a lawyer?" The agent looked at him calmly. "That's your choice." The implication was clear. Stephen watched as the officer stepped away, shoulders tight, confidence gone. His career, whatever shape it would take after this, was no longer in his control. A reporter pushed closer. "Mr. Seagal, do you have any comment?" Stephen paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about making sure no one else experiences this." That sentence spread quickly. Within minutes, notifications buzzed across phones in the crowd. Social media posts were already circulating. Clips uploaded. Headlines forming in real time. Public detention raises questions of bias. Witnesses record officers' actions. Investigation underway after handcuffing incident. The officer noticed people looking at their screens. His face paled. He knew. The supervisor turned to him one last time. "You're dismissed. Turn in your equipment before leaving." The officer nodded silently and walked toward the patrol car, each step heavier than the last. No one cheered. They didn't need to. Stephen finally took a step back, adjusting his jacket. The cameras followed, but he didn't flinch. A young woman approached him. "Thank you for staying calm," she said. "That couldn't have been easy." Stephen smiled faintly. "Anger only helps injustice," he replied. "Calm exposes it." More phones recorded that too. The internal affairs agent returned to the supervisor. "We'll be recommending immediate suspension pending full review." The supervisor nodded. Understood. Suspension. In the world of law enforcement, that word carried consequences. Careers had ended over less. Stephen glanced once more toward the patrol car. The officer sat inside now, staring straight ahead, radio silent, badge gone. 9 minutes earlier, he had been in control. Now, everything had changed. The supervisor turned to Stephen. "Sir, again, our apologies." Stephen nodded. "I hope this leads to change." The supervisor met his eyes. "So do we." The crowd slowly began to disperse, conversations buzzing, emotions raw. But the cameras didn't stop. They never do. Because the real consequences were just beginning. Do you think incidents like this usually end with real consequences, or do they get forgotten? Comment accountability, or covered up below. By the next morning, the footage was everywhere. Every major platform carried clips of the incident, edited, slowed down, replayed from multiple angles. The moment the cuffs snapped shut. The crowd's reaction. The body cam audio. Stephen's calm voice cutting through the chaos. The narrative was no longer in anyone's control. News outlets picked it up first. Officer suspended after public detention sparks outrage. Video raises questions of racial bias and abuse of power. Witness footage contradicts officer's report. Within hours, the story went global. Steven Seagal woke up to hundreds of messages. Some were from friends. Some from activists. Others from complete strangers who had lived through similar moments, but without cameras, without witnesses, without justice. "This happened to me," one message read. "No one believed me," said another. Stephen read them quietly. He didn't rush to interviews. He didn't post a statement immediately. He understood something most people didn't. This moment wasn't about him speaking louder. It was about the truth already speaking for itself. By noon, the police department released an official statement. Following a review of body camera footage and witness evidence, the officer involved has been terminated effective immediately. No suspension. No administrative leave. Terminated. The word spread fast. Comment sections exploded. Some celebrated. Some argued. Some denied. But no one could ignore it. The officer's name disappeared from the department's roster by the end of the day. His badge number archived. His career, over in less than 10 minutes of bad judgment. Stephen finally agreed to a brief interview that evening. When asked how he felt about the outcome, he paused. "I don't feel victorious," he said calmly. "I feel responsible." The interviewer leaned forward. "Responsible for what?" "For reminding people that authority must answer to accountability," Stephen replied. "And that silence only protects injustice." That quote went viral too. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Advocacy groups shared the footage as a teaching example. Law schools analyzed the body cam timeline. Community leaders used the incident to push for policy reviews and mandatory bias training. What began as a single stop had become a reference point. A line that couldn't be uncrossed again without consequences. Stephen returned to his normal life, but something had changed. Everywhere he went, people recognized him not as an action star, but as someone who had stood still when it mattered most. A man who didn't raise his voice, didn't resist, didn't run, and still forced the system to answer. Late that night, Stephen posted one final message online. It was short. No hashtags. No slogans. Justice works best when witnesses refuse to look away. That was it. No follow-up. No self-promotion. The post was shared millions of times. Because the lesson wasn't complicated. Power unchecked becomes dangerous. Silence becomes permission. And accountability, real accountability, only happens when people stay present. The officer lost his career in 9 minutes. But the impact of those 9 minutes would last far longer. Not because someone famous was involved, but because the world was watching. And this time, the truth didn't blink first. If you believe no one should be judged, detained, or humiliated because of how they look, like this video, type "respect" in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories where accountability wins.